The sun was dying over the Texas plains the way it always did in August, not gently, not with any grace, but like something burning through its last reserves, throwing everything it had left across the sky in shades of red and copper, in a deep bruised orange that stained the dry grass and the cracked earth and the faces of anyone still foolish enough to be outside at that hour. It was the kind of sunset that looked almost beautiful if you did not know what it meant. And Caleb Harrow knew what it meant. It meant another day was gone. Another day of the same dry heat, the same thin wind, the same sky with no mercy in it. He had stopped finding sunsets beautiful sometime in the last 3 years. He was not entirely sure when it had happened. He only knew that somewhere between the fever and the funerals and the slow grinding work of keeping a dying ranch alive by himself, the beauty of things had quietly left him like a lamp turned down, so gradually that you never noticed the room getting darker, until one day you realized you could not see your hands in front of your face. He sat on the wagon bench with his back straight and his hands loose on the reins, and he let the old mare set her own pace toward Dunhamore because she knew the road better than he needed to direct her. His hat was pulled low against the last of the sun. It was a brown felt hat worn soft at the brim, the kind that had been shaped by years of use until it fit his head the way nothing new ever quite managed to. Margaret had given it to him in the first year of their marriage. He had never told anyone that. It was not the sort of thing a man explained. He needed barley. That was the only reason he was making this trip. The feed bin had run short, and the cattle that were left, the 60 headed that had survived 2 seasons of drought and one particularly brutal winter, needed to eat tomorrow morning. So he was going to Dunmore. He was going to buy barley loaded into the wagon and drive the 12 miles home in the dark. He had done it before. He would do it again. That was how the days worked now. You identified what needed doing, and you did it, and you did not think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was how a man lost his footing. There were things he did not let himself think about. He did not think about the telegram from the bank that was folded in the drawer of the kitchen table, the one requesting partial payment within 30 days. He did not think about the well that was dropping an inch a week and had been dropping all summer. He did not think about the east pasture fence that had 3 sections down and needed repairing before he could move the cattle there. He kept his thoughts small and practical and immediate, like a man carrying a lantern through a cave who learns not to look at the walls and just watches the ground directly under his feet. The wagon bench had 2 seats. The right side was dusty in a way the left side was not. He had noticed this once about a year after, when he was cleaning the wagon for no particular reason on a Sunday afternoon, and he had stopped and looked at that dust for a long time without touching it. Then he had finished cleaning the rest of the wagon and left that side alone. He could not have explained why. He just had. Dunmore appeared in the gathering dusk as a cluster of lit windows and the smell of cook fires and the sound of a dog barking somewhere near the livery. It was not a large town. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a bank that was too interested in his business, a saloon that he had no use for, and a train station that sat at the southern edge of town like an afterthought. Roy Webb ran the station. He had run it for 22 years, and he knew every soul in the county, and he had the particular quality of a man who understood that information was only valuable if you knew when not to share it. Caleb pulled the mare up near the station loading dock because the general store was just across from it, and he wanted to check on a piece of equipment he had asked Ned Porter to order 3 weeks ago. He climbed down from the wagon and stretched his back and was moving toward the store when Roy Webb stepped out of the station office door and put himself directly in Caleb's path. Roy was 58 years old and had the face of a man who had spent decades squinting into distance. He was not a tall man, but he had a way of standing that took up a conversation before he opened his mouth. "Before you go in," Roy said. Caleb stopped. "I just need barley and to check on that part I ordered." "I know what you need." Roy tilted his head, a small motion toward the far end of the platform. "But you ought to see this first." Caleb looked. The platform ran the length of the station building and then continued past it into a shadowed overhang where a single bench sat against the wall. At that bench, barely visible in the deep shadow at the platform's end, a figure sat very still. "She came in on the morning train," Roy said. His voice was flat and careful the way it got when he was carrying something he did not like. "Warren Doyle sent for her, or mail order arrangement. He came out to meet her, took one look, said she was not what he had ordered, and rode off." Caleb said nothing. "That was 8 o'clock this morning," Roy said. Caleb looked at the figure on the bench. He could see the shape of a woman now sitting with her back straight against the station wall, her hands in her lap. Even at this distance, even in this light, there was something in the way she was sitting that made the back of his neck tighten. It was not the posture of someone who had given up. It was the posture of someone who was refusing to. Next train is Thursday, Caleb said. I know it. That's 4 days. I know that too. Roy said nothing else. That was the thing about Roy Webb. He knew when to stop talking. Caleb stood there for a moment looking at the shadowed end of the platform, and then he did something he had not planned to do. He walked toward her. His boots were loud on the wooden boards. He walked slowly, not wanting to startle her. She did not turn until he was close enough that his shadow fell across her, and when she finally lifted her face, what he saw stopped something in his chest and held it still for just a second. She was not defeated. That was the thing. He had expected to see what he would have seen in most people after a day like that. A kind of collapse, a redness around the eyes, a slackening of the jaw that comes when a person has used up everything they had and there is nothing left but the bare frame. He had seen that look before. He had seen it in the mirror for the better part of 3 years. But this woman had not collapsed. Her eyes were gray with something in them that he could not immediately name, a quality of watchfulness, of assessment, as if she was the one deciding whether he was worth speaking to. Her dress was blue, and had been a better blue, once faded now from what had clearly been many careful washings. Her hair was pinned up and had held through most of the day, only a few strands working loose around her face in the heat. She looked like a woman who had decided somewhere between the morning and now that this was simply a problem that needed to be solved, and she was waiting for the right piece of the solution to present itself. He noticed her hands. They were folded in her lap with a tightness that told him everything her face would not. Ma'am, he said, and his voice came out rough, the way it always did when he had not spoken much during the day, which was most days. I'm waiting for the train, she said. The next one comes Thursday. I know. That's 4 days. I know that too. She held his gaze without any particular hostility, without warmth, without performance of any kind. She was simply looking at him and waiting to find out what kind of person he was going to turn out to be. There is no boarding house in Dunmore that takes women traveling alone, he said. Something shifted in her expression, small and quick there, and gone. I will manage, she said. I have lived here 37 years, he said. There is nowhere safe for you to stay. I am not saying this to alarm you. I am saying it because it is true, and it seems like something you ought to know. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense that she was running some kind of calculation, rapid and precise, the kind of mental arithmetic people do when they are deciding how much trust they can afford. My name is Caleb Harrow, he said. I have a ranch 12 miles north of here. I need someone to handle the cooking and the housekeeping. The job pays fair wages. There is a private room. 3 meals a day. He paused. It is honest work, and I am not offering it out of pity. My kitchen is a disgrace, and I have more work to do on this ranch than I have hours in the day. A long pause. The wind moved through the gap between the station building and the loading dock, and brought with it the smell of dry grass and something distant that might have been rain, though rain had been a rumor for months. I don't accept charities, she said. I am not offering any. Another pause. Then she said very quietly, I can cook. Then we have an arrangement, he said. He bent and lifted one end of her trunk to test the weight of it, and when he did, something registered in him with quiet force. The trunk was almost nothing. It was the weight of a few folded garments and whatever small necessities a woman could carry when she had packed everything she owned into one box before boarding a train into an uncertain future. She had come here carrying almost nothing, prepared to start a life from almost nothing, and she had sat on this bench all day with her back straight and her hands folded and her chin level, and she had not asked a single person for help. He carried the trunk to the wagon without saying anything more about its weight. She followed him across the platform and down the steps, and when she climbed up onto the bench, she positioned herself at the very edge of the right side and as far from him as the seat allowed. He noted the distance and said nothing about it. He understood it. That distance was not unfriendliness. It was the boundary that a person draws when they have been burned enough times that they have stopped assuming the space beside them is safe until proven otherwise. He turned the mare north, and they left Dunmore behind in the last of the evening light. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The road unrolled ahead of them, through dry country brown grass on either side, the sky deepening from orange to a dark clear blue overhead. Somewhere to the west, very far off, heat lightning stuttered silently along the horizon. The mare's hooves were steady on the packed earth. It was the woman who broke the silence first, and she did it in a way that caught him entirely off guard. "How long have you been without your wife?" she asked. He almost dropped the reins. He recovered and held still for a moment before he answered. "How did you know? A man who has had a woman running his household for any length of time has a different relationship to disorder than a man who has always lived alone," she said. "You have the look of someone who knows what order feels like and has been watching it come undone for a while. That is different from someone who never had it." He was quiet for a moment. "3 years," he said. "Children. One, a boy, he went with his mother." She absorbed this the way he had learned to wish more people would absorb it, without the rush to fill the space with words, without the sorry for your loss that always sounded like something people said because they did not know what else to say. She received it with a single small nod, the kind that meant, "I have heard you and I understand the weight of what you just told me." He found to his surprise that it was not nothing. They rode on in silence after that, and as the miles passed, Caleb became aware of something he had not expected. He was not uncomfortable. He had grown so accustomed to the particular quality of his own solitude that he could no longer tell whether it was preference or simply habit, whether the quiet had become something he chose or something that had simply settled over him the way dust settles over an unused room. This silence was different. It had texture. It had another person's breathing in it, another person's presence, and for the first time in a long while, the 12 miles of road between Dunmore and home felt like a distance worth traveling. When the ranch came into view, at the end of the long drive, he felt the usual tightening in his chest, the flinch of a man who sees his own life through a stranger's eyes and knows how it must look. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted, and he had shored it up with a cedar plank that was not quite the right size. The windmill turned lazily, one blade slightly off-kilter. The barn needed paint, and the fence along the north side of the yard had 2 rails down. He was about to say something about it, some preemptive acknowledgement of the state of things, when she spoke. "It looks like a place that used to be very good," she said, "and would be again if someone decided it should be." He held those words and did not answer them because he did not know how. In 3 years of living on this ranch alone, of watching it slowly decline, the way everything declines when there is only one pair of hands and one person's worth of energy to maintain it, no one had looked at it and seen what it could be instead of what it currently was. He did not know why that simple thing hit him as hard as it did. He only knew that it did. She told him her name as they pulled up to the barn. Eliza Crane. He unhitched the mare and she took her trunk inside without asking where to put it, and by the time he had finished with the horse and come through the back door, she had found the kitchen and was already working. He stopped in the doorway. She had opened the flour bin and checked the salt pork and found the dried beans at the back of the pantry shelf, and she was building a fire in the stove with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not waste motion. She had not asked where anything was. She had simply looked until she found it. The fire caught. Water went into the pot. The beans went in after. She found cornmeal and fat and a cast iron skillet hanging on the wall, and she started working the cornbread dough without looking up. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her movements unhurried and certain. Caleb stood in the doorway and could not move. It was the smell that did it. The smell of a fire in that stove of beans beginning to heat of cornmeal, an iron of coffee that she had put on when he was not watching. 3 smells that had been absent from this kitchen for 3 years and that now arrived together without warning and hit him somewhere in the chest with the force of something he had no defense against. Memory does not ask permission. It does not knock. It simply arrives and it brings everything with it all at once, and there is nothing to do but stand there and let it come. He stood in the doorway until she looked up. She did not ask if he was all right. She looked at him once with those steady gray eyes, and then she looked back at what she was doing, and that was the right thing. He was grateful for it. They sat down to eat at the table where he had eaten alone for 1,000 evenings, and the food was better than anything he had made for himself in 3 years, which was not saying much, but it was also simply good on its own terms. The beans rich and salted right, the cornbread browned in the skillet. He picked up a piece of the cornbread. It was round, cut into wedges from a round skillet cake the way his mother had made it, the way Margaret had made it. His hand stopped. My wife made it round, he said. He did not know why he said it. The words came out before he had decided to say them, which was the way things sometimes came out when a person had been keeping them in for too long. Eliza did not look away from him. She did not reach across the table or change her expression into something softer than it naturally was. She met his eyes and said quietly, "My mother taught me that way. She said cornbread that comes out square means the cook was in too much of a hurry." It was a small thing, a coincidence of method. Two women in different parts of the country arriving at the same conclusion about cornbread through different routes. But underneath the small thing was something larger, the simple fact that she had offered him something of her own in return for what he had offered a detail about her mother, which told him something he filed away without knowing quite why. Her mother had taught her. Her mother had been there long enough to teach her, and was gone. After supper, he showed her the room at the end of the hall. It was small and clean and cold, with a single window that looked out toward the east pasture. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and said nothing for a moment. "Breakfast is at 5, he said. "I'll be up," she said. "The water pump is outside the back door. There's a basin and a pitcher in the room." "Thank you," she said. And then with a gravity that told him she meant it specifically and not as a social formula, "For bringing me here." He was halfway down the hall when he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his hand against the wall and then said without turning around, "Don't thank me yet. This land takes more than it gives." He heard her door close softly behind him. He walked out to the porch and sat on the old chair that faced east, the one he always sat in because the other one was where she used to sit, and he looked out at the dark shape of the pasture and the black line of the distant hills and the great wash of stars above them. The air had cooled enough to make sitting outside bearable. A coyote called somewhere far to the north, and another answered it from a different direction. He sat there for a long time. And in the silence of that Texas night, which he knew better than almost anything else in his life, he noticed something that he had not heard in 3 years, and that he had not realized he was missing until this moment. It was nothing dramatic. It was not a voice or a sound of any particular kind. It was simply the fact that somewhere behind the wall at his back, in the small room at the end of the hall, there was another person breathing. The silence was the same silence it had always been, and yet it was not. He could not have said why precisely. He only knew the difference, and that the difference was enough to sit with until he was ready to go inside. He went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular until sleep came, which happened faster than it had in longer than he could remember. The second morning he came into the kitchen at 4:30 because that was when his body woke him up, and that was when he always started his day. He expected the cold, dark kitchen. He expected to start his own fire and boil his own water and eat whatever he could assemble from what was on hand. Instead, the kitchen was lit and warm and smelled of bacon and coffee and something baking in the oven that turned out to be biscuits, and Eliza was at the stove with her back to him, her hair pinned up and her sleeves already rolled, working with the same quiet confidence she had shown the night before. She did not turn around when he came in. She said without looking, "Sit down, 5 minutes." He sat down. She put a plate in front of him that contained things he had not eaten together at breakfast in longer than he wanted to calculate, and she poured coffee from the pot on the stove and set the cup beside the plate and went back to her own cooking without ceremony. He bowed his head and said the short grace he had said every morning of his life because his father had said it and his father's father had said it, and it was the kind of practice a man keeps not because he is certain of the theology, but because it connects him to something longer than himself. When he looked up, she had her head bowed too, and she said amen at the end of his amen, and neither of them mentioned it. They ate in what was already becoming, after only one night, a different kind of silence than the one he was used to. His silence had been the silence of a man alone in a room. This was the silence of two people who had decided without discussing it that they did not need to fill every moment with talk. When the plates were cleared, he told her what the day required. He needed to start on the dam. He had been planning it for 2 months, ever since he had walked the East Rise and mapped the natural basin at its foot, and understood that if he built a retention wall before the rains came, and if the rains came and if they were substantial enough, He could store enough runoff to carry the remaining herd through the dry months that would follow. It was a project that required daily work for several weeks. Alone, he was not sure he could finish it before the weather window closed. She untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. "Show me where to dig," she said. "You don't need to do that. The house needs—" "The house can wait," she said. "The cattle can't." There was no opening in her tone for an argument. He recognized that quality. It was the tone of a person who has decided and whose decisions are not performances. He pulled on his hat and picked up the pickaxe that was leaning against the back wall, and he handed her the long-handled shovel, and they went out together into the cool gray of the early morning. The work was hard and the ground was hard, and the sun, once it cleared the hills to the east, was relentless. Caleb swung the pickaxe into the packed clay and broken stone of the basin floor, breaking it loose, and Eliza shoveled the loosened material to the side and began piling it into the growing wall with the steady, rhythmic commitment of someone who understands the difference between working hard and working smart. She was not trying to move everything at once. She was finding the pace that could be maintained, and she was maintaining it. They worked through the morning in that rhythm, and as the hours passed and the sweat came and the dam wall grew, Caleb found himself noticing things about her the way you notice things when you are working alongside someone and there is nothing to do but work and observe. She looked at the ground before she dug into it, a small hesitation, a moment of assessment, as though she was reading it for what it wanted to yield and what it would resist. It was the habit of someone who had worked with land before, or at least of someone who paid attention to the world under their feet. At some point in the late morning, she stopped beside a dead cottonwood at the edge of the basin, a tree that had been dead for at least 2 seasons, its bark going gray and soft, its few remaining branches bare against the sky. She put her hand flat against the trunk and stood there for a moment with her eyes down. He had stopped walking and was watching her before he knew he meant to. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Saying goodbye," she said simply. "It stood here before either of us was born." He did not have a response to that. He stood there for a moment, then picked up the pickaxe and kept walking. But he thought about it. He thought about the kind of person who would stop in the middle of hard labor under a brutal sun to acknowledge a dead tree, and he thought that it was a quality he recognized in some way he could not name. And he kept working. Around midday, she slipped. The basin floor had a section of loose shale near the south wall, where the clay gave way to a deeper layer of broken rock, and her boot found the edge of it wrong, and she went down hard and fast, one knee hitting the ground, both hands slamming out to catch herself. Caleb was beside her before the sound of the fall had finished, reaching down, catching her arm, and she came up with a short, startled sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Brief and surprised, as if it had escaped from somewhere she had been keeping it locked up. It hit him like a wave of warm water breaking unexpectedly. He had not heard a laugh close to him in years. He had almost forgotten what it did to the air around it. Then he saw her hands. The palms were torn open where she had hit the shale. The skin was raw and bleeding grit embedded in the wounds. "Why didn't you say something?" he said, and he heard the roughness in his own voice. "It's nothing," she said. "It's not nothing." He put down the pickaxe and reached into his jacket pocket where he kept a small tin of the salve he made each spring according to the formula Margaret had written down in the back of the household ledger: beeswax and golden seal, and a little calendula. The formula she had gotten from her own mother and had written out carefully in her neat small hand. He kept making it because he kept needing it, and because he had not been able to bring himself to use any other kind. He opened the tin and she extended her hands without being asked, palms up, and he spread the salve carefully across the torn skin while she held still and did not pull away. The sun was high and the light was direct, and there was nowhere for either of them to look except at what his hands were doing, and the space between them was close with the smell of sweat and earth and the faint medicinal smell of the salve. He became aware at some point in those moments of something that he had not been aware of in a long time. He was paying attention to another human being with the full weight of his attention, not performing a task, not going through the motions of interaction. He was present in the simple and complete way that the word actually means. And she was present too, very still, watching his hands with an expression that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but was something else entirely, some quality of stillness that comes when a person decides that a moment is worth inhabiting fully. He was just closing the tin when the sound came from the rise to the south. 3 horses. coming fast. He stood up and turned and felt Eliza stand behind him, and then without anything being said, stepped slightly to his side. Not behind him, beside him. The riders came over the rise and pulled up at the edge of the basin and sat their horses in a line with the afternoon sun behind them, which meant Caleb had to look into the light to see their faces. He did not think this was accidental. The man in the center was broad-shouldered and wore a gray suit that had no business being within 50 miles of a working ranch. He was 52 years old and had the face of a man who had learned early that patience and money applied in the right sequence could accomplish everything that force accomplished and at considerably less personal risk. His name was Douglas Holt, and Caleb had known of him for years, the way you know of a weather system that has not yet reached you, but that you have been watching on the horizon. To his left was a younger man, 30 years old, compact and dark-eyed, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to keep his reactions off his face. This was Cole Holt Douglas's nephew, who ran the day-to-day operations of the Holt Holdings and who was, by all accounts, more intelligent than his uncle and more dangerous for it. It was Cole who looked at Eliza. He looked at her the way people look at something they recognize and were hoping not to see. Not a long look. A quick assessment, a flicker of something behind his eyes that tightened and then went carefully neutral. She was standing close enough to Caleb that he felt her notice it too, though she said nothing. "Harrow," Douglas Holt said and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had smiled at a great many people who were not happy to see him. "Heard you were building something out here. Thought I'd come and take a look." "You've looked," Caleb said. "You can head back now." Holt swung down from his horse with the ease of a large man who was comfortable in his body. His boots crunched on the dry shale as he walked a few steps toward the rising dam wall and looked at it with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Water that feeds this basin," he said conversationally, "comes off those hills." He gestured north and west. "Before you decided to hold it back, it ran through the natural drainage onto my land to the east." "You don't own rainfall, Holt." "No," Holt agreed pleasantly, "but I own the land it falls on, and the land it flows across." He turned back from the dam wall and looked at Caleb directly. "What you're building here interrupts a natural watercourse. There are legal questions." "Bring your legal questions to the county meeting," Caleb said. "I'll answer them there." Holt's smile did not change. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at a detail he has already cataloged and set aside. Cole stepped his horse forward slightly, just enough to establish something. "What's your name?" he asked her. His voice was easy and almost warm, the voice of a man who is good at seeming harmless. "She doesn't owe you an answer," Caleb said. He said it without raising his voice, without heat, with the simple finality of a man who has drawn a line and is not going to move from it. "She's family." Something happened in the air between the four of them when he said that word. Douglas Holt's eyebrows rose slightly. Cole Holt's expression did something careful and controlled. And Caleb himself felt the words settle into him after he had said it the way a plank settles when you finally drive the nail on all the way home. And he was aware that he had said something whose full implications he was not ready to examine, and that he had said it anyway, and that he did not want to take it back. Holt mounted his horse. He looked down at Caleb from the height of the saddle with the particular look of a man who has never found it necessary to shout because he has always found it sufficient to simply wait. "Sell me this land while you still can, Harrow," he said, "before the drought does it for you." "It's not for sale." "Everything is for sale," Holt said. "The only question is what kind of situation a man has to be in before he accepts that." He reined his horse around. "Wells run dry, cattle die. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." He rode back over the rise. Cole followed without looking back, except for one final glance at Eliza that lasted just long enough to be a message. The sound of the hooves faded. Caleb stood in the empty basin beside the unfinished dam wall and listened to the silence settle back over the land. Beside him, Eliza let out a long, slow breath. "Cole looked at me like he knew who I was," she said. "Did you recognize him?" A pause. "No, but there is something I should tell you." She stopped. "About why I ended up on that platform. About the arrangement with Warren Doyle and how it came to be." She did not get to finish the sentence. Roy Webb appeared on the rise from the North Road, riding faster than Roy Webb usually rode anywhere, which was itself an alarm of a quiet kind. He pulled his horse up and came down the slope and handed Caleb a folded telegram without a word. Caleb opened it. He read it once. He read it again. Cattle prices down 40% across the region. Major buyers withdrawing from regional contracts. Hold all shipments pending market review. He folded it along its original lines and put it in his pocket. Bad news, Roy asked. Seems to be the only kind these days. Roy looked at the dam, looked at the retreating dust of Holt's riders still visible on the southern horizon, looked at Caleb and then at Eliza. He had the expression of a man adding numbers he has seen before. Storm's coming, he said. Could be 2 weeks, could be less. You want that dam to matter, you need it done before the weather gets here. He rode back toward town. The sun was lower now, beginning its final descent, turning the sky to the colors of something burning out. Caleb stood at the edge of his unfinished dam and looked out across the dry basin and thought about the telegram in his pocket and the legal questions Holt had mentioned and the way Cole Holt had looked at Eliza with that flash of recognition and calculation. She came and stood beside him, and they looked at the horizon together, where the far edge of the sky was beginning to show the dark gray-blue smudging that meant weather building somewhere a long way off. "Will you finish it in time?" she asked. "Not alone, Sarntis." She said nothing for a moment. "Then you're not alone." He looked at her. In the early evening light, her face was steady and direct, with nothing performative in it. She was not trying to reassure him. She was simply stating a fact. He looked back at the horizon, the distant building darkness, the first hint of what was coming. He had ridden to Dunmore for a sack of barley. He had come home with something he did not yet have a name for, something that had been absent from this land and from his life for 3 years, something that was not yet what it might become, but was already unmistakably more than what it had been this morning. And standing on the edge of his unfinished dam in the last light of an August evening, with a storm building in the west and a telegram in his pocket, and a woman he had known for less than a day standing calmly at his side, Caleb Harrow felt something shift in the center of him. Not large, not sudden, more like the sound the ground makes when a dry creek bed receives the first water of a season, a small sound, almost nothing but underneath it, the knowledge that something has changed and that the change, once started, does not go back. He put his hat back on and picked up the pickaxe. "Tomorrow we start before dawn," he said. "I'll be up," she said. And they walked back toward the ranch house together through the cooling evening air. And for the first time in 3 years, when Caleb Harrow pushed open the door of his home, it did not sound hollow. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Caleb had not known his life was capable of anymore. He had grown accustomed over 3 years to the particular texture of days lived entirely alone. He knew the sound of his own boots on the kitchen floor in the dark before dawn. He knew the exact weight of his own silence at the breakfast table, the way a man knows the weight of a coat he has worn so long he has stopped noticing he is carrying it. He had told himself, in the way people tell themselves things that are not entirely true, but that are necessary to continue functioning, that he had made a kind of peace with it, that the solitude was manageable, that he had adjusted. He understood now that he had not adjusted. He had simply gone numb the way a hand goes numb when held too long in cold water, and the return of sensation, like all returns of sensation, was something between relief and pain. Every morning she was up before him. This became within the first week a fact as reliable as sunrise itself. He would come through the kitchen door at 4:30 to find the stove already lit and the coffee already on, and Eliza already moving through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made her peace with early hours long ago. She did not greet him with words every morning. Sometimes she said good morning, and sometimes she simply set a plate in front of him and poured the coffee and went back to what she was doing. He found after the first few mornings that he did not need the words. He only needed the evidence of another person having been there before him, the warm stove and the lit lamp, and the knowledge that the house had not been silent all night. They ate breakfast in what had become, without discussion, a comfortable silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say to each other. The silence of people who have enough of an understanding already forming that they do not need to talk through every moment in order to feel its value. Then they went to work. The dam grew slowly because the ground was difficult, and because 2 people is still, only 2 people however willing, and because the Texas summer made everything harder by adding the weight of heat to every hour of labor. Caleb swung the pickaxe until his shoulders ached and then kept swinging. Eliza shoveled and hauled and packed the growing wall with a steadiness that he had stopped finding surprising and started finding simply reliable, which is a different and deeper thing. She had learned the work quickly as she seemed to learn everything quickly, and she had adapted her pace to it without complaint, finding the rhythm that could be sustained across a full day rather than the harder pace that burns bright for 2 hours and then collapses. He noticed things about her the way you notice things when you are working alongside someone in heat and silence, and the days begin to accumulate. She kept her tools clean at the end of each day, wiping the shovel blade before hanging it and checking the handle for splinters that might worsen with use. It was the habit of someone who understood that taking care of the tools that take care of you is not a small thing. She remembered everything. If he mentioned in passing that the south wall of the dam needed more material on the lower section, she would be working on the lower section of the south wall before he said another word about it. If he said the mare needed to be checked before noon because she had seemed stiff that morning, Eliza had checked the mare before he thought of it again. She talked to the cattle, not much, not in any way that would have sounded strange to an outside observer. But when she brought water to the trough in the evening and the remaining herd came in, she said things to them in a low, ordinary voice, as if informing them of the state of things. She had given the two remaining cows names within the first week, Grace and Patience, and when he had raised an eyebrow at this, she had said simply that unnamed things had a harder time surviving, and then she had gone back to what she was doing. He had thought about that for longer than made sense. It was on the fifth night that the deeper things began to come to the surface. He had come inside late after checking the fence along the east property line, and he found Eliza at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her and a pen in her hand and nothing written on the paper at all. She was not looking at the page. She was looking at the lamp. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter and looked at her without asking anything. Sometimes the not asking was what opened a door. She said after a while, without looking up from the lamp, "I write letters I don't send." He said nothing. "Not to anyone specific," she said, "just to whoever needs to hear whatever I need to say. When I'm done, I burn them." A pause. "It sounds strange." "It doesn't," he said, and it didn't. She set the pen down. She looked at the blank page for a moment longer, and then she looked at him with the directness that he had come to recognize as simply the way she looked at things without artifice or performance, only the plain acknowledgement of what was in front of her. "My name was Eliza Ward before it was Eliza Crane," she said. "I took Philip Crane's name before we were married because I thought we would be married and because it felt like something of my own to keep." She stopped. He was a printer in Philadelphia, intelligent. He read everything he could find, and he talked about what he read, and it was very easy when I was 22 years old and alone in a city and working 12 hours a day at a tailor shop to believe that a man who read books and talked about them must have a good soul. She said this last part without bitterness. It was a statement of fact about a younger version of herself that she had clearly arrived at from a great distance. "We made promises," she continued, "not formal ones, not before a minister, but promises made in private that I believed were the same weight as any public vow. I believed that because I needed to believe it and because he said the right things at the right moments." She paused again. "One morning he did not come to where we had agreed to meet. I waited 2 hours. I went to the print shop. His foreman told me he had not come in. I went back the next morning. His foreman told me he was no longer employed there." Caleb waited. "He was simply gone," she said. "No letter, no explanation, no word of any kind. He had been making other arrangements, I learned later, for some time. He left for Chicago with a woman whose family had money, which mine did not. I learned this from a woman at my church 6 weeks after he had already gone." She looked at her hands folded on the table. "I kept his name because by then it was the only thing I had taken from the arrangement, and I was not going to give even that back to someone who had not bothered to ask for it." He had been watching her face while she spoke, and what he saw there was not grief and was not anger and was not the residue of either. It was something more settled than both the expression of someone who has done the work of coming to terms with a thing and arrived at a place that is not healed exactly, but is at least no longer bleeding. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "That man," he said, "does not deserve to have you carry his name." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression fast and not entirely controlled the kind of reaction that happens when a person hears something said plainly that they have thought many times in private and have never heard validated in the open air. That is the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me about it, she said. He looked at the lamp for a moment. Then, because it was the only fair response to what she had given him, he said her name was Margaret. He had not said her name out loud to another person in so long that the word felt strange in his mouth. Not bad, strange in the way that a room feels strange when you open it after years and find that the air inside has been still all that time waiting. She was kind in the particular way that patient people are kind, he said. Not performing it, just built that way. He stopped. Thomas was 4 years old. He looked like her. He had her eyes, which were brown with a kind of green in them, depending on the light, and he had her way of paying attention to things that most people walk past without seeing. He looked at his own hands on the table. The fever took him before I could get back with the doctor. I was on the road when it happened. I have thought about that road many thousands of times since. You would not have saved him, Eliza said. Not gently, not as consolation, as a statement of fact offered cleanly. I know that, he said, but knowing is not the same as feeling. No, he said, it never is. The lamp burned between them. Outside, a nighthawk called once and then was silent. The house was very quiet, the deep quiet of the plains after the last of the day's wind has died, a quiet so total it has weight. Eliza did not reach across the table. She did not offer the particular softness that people sometimes offer in these moments. The softness that is well meant, but that can feel to a person deep in grief like being patted on the head. She simply sat there with him in the fact of what he had said and let it exist without trying to make it smaller. He blew out the lamp when they finally went to bed, and in the darkness he walked to his room and lay down and listened to the house and thought that there was something profoundly strange about the fact that he had spoken Margaret's name out loud tonight for the first time to a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks, and that it had not felt like a betrayal and had not felt like loss. It had felt like the simple act of telling the truth to someone capable of receiving it. He went to sleep without effort, which had not happened in longer than he could remember. 3 days later, the first cattle died. The sky that morning carried a wrongness that had nothing to do with its color. It was too still, the air sitting flat and heavy in a way that made the lungs work harder, the kind of morning that old ranchers read like a sentence they have seen before and do not want to finish. Caleb was outside before full light, and he walked the perimeter of the barn and came around the back and found her. One of the older cows, a black-sided animal that had been with the ranch since before the drought began, lay against the back wall of the barn with her legs stiff and her tongue gone dark in the particular stillness of something that had been dead for several hours. Vise had found her. The air around her was thick with heat and the smell of it. He stood and looked at her for a long moment with his hat in his hands. By noon, there were 2 more. He checked the well. The bucket came up with 4 inches of water and a thick slurry of silt at the bottom. He dropped it again. It came up with 3 inches and more silt. He dropped it a third time and it came up with almost nothing. The trough in the yard was dry clay, cracked into a pattern that looked like something broken and left to bleach. The cattle that were still on their feet stood in the shade of the barn, with their heads low, conserving whatever they had left, which was not much. He started digging the burial pit himself because there was no one else to do it, and because leaving the dead animals where they lay was not something he was willing to do. He dug in the heat of the afternoon with a spade that kept glancing off buried rock, and he worked steadily and without haste because that was the only way to work when the task was too large and the energy too limited, and the heat was pressing down on everything like a physical weight. He was halfway through when his legs gave, not dramatically, not with any violence. They simply stopped being able to do what he was asking of them, and he sat down hard on the edge of the half-dug pit and put his arms on his knees and dropped his head and breathed. His vision was doing something at the edges that it did when a man had pushed past the boundary of what the body will cooperate with a slight unreality, a loosening of the edges of things. He sat there and looked at the dry ground between his feet. He was not thinking about the cattle. He was thinking about Thomas. He was thinking about the way Thomas used to run to the barn in the mornings, always running, always in a hurry to get to the animals before anything else, and how Caleb had sometimes watched him from the kitchen window and felt something so complete and uncomplicated in his chest that he had not known what to call it except right. Everything was right when his son was running toward the barn in the morning, and then it was not right, and it had not been right since. He sat on the edge of the pit and looked at the ground and thought, what is the point of this? Not out of despair exactly, but out of the genuine and exhausted question of a man who has been doing hard things alone for 3 years and is sitting in the dirt next to 3 dead animals in a dry well and cannot, in this particular moment, locate the reason to stand up again. He did not hear her coming. He only knew she was there when the shadow fell over him. Eliza did not say anything. She did not reach down and pull him up. She did not tell him to get back to work or remind him of everything that needed doing. She simply sat down on the ground beside him, right there on the hot, dry earth, at the edge of the burial pit in the full afternoon sun, and sat with him. She stayed there for what must have been 10 minutes, saying nothing at all. It was the right thing. He was not sure he could have explained why it was the right thing, only that all the things that would have been wrong were the things that involved filling the space with sound. She left it empty, and that emptiness held him the way silence sometimes holds a person better than any words. Finally, she said without looking at him, "We need supplies. I'll make a list." "I'll go," he said. He heard his own voice come back to him from somewhere rough and tired but present. He straightened. He put his hands on his knees. He stood. She stood beside him. "I'll have the list ready in an hour," she said. And that was the thing he thought as he walked back toward the house to clean up before the ride into town. That was the particular thing about her that he kept running into and that he had no adequate category for. She did not try to make the hard things smaller. She did not pretend they were manageable or suggest that the right attitude would change their weight. She just stayed, and then she moved forward, and somehow that was enough to pull a man along with her. He rode into Dunmore in the late afternoon with her list in his jacket pocket, and things went wrong almost from the moment he walked through the door of Ned Porter's general store. There were 4 men inside, which was 2 or 3 more than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Porter himself was behind the counter with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has already assessed a situation and wants no part of the middle of it. The other 3 men arranged themselves with the particular casualness of people who are exactly where they intended to be. Cole Holt was leaning against the far end of the counter with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was almost pleasant, in the way that things are sometimes almost pleasant when they are trying to be something they are not. "Harrow," Cole said, "you're looking tired." "I have work to do," Caleb said. He moved to the counter and handed Porter the list without looking at Cole. "Hard to run a ranch properly," Cole said, addressing the room in general, with the ease of someone performing for an audience. "When a man is spending his time building structures, he doesn't have legal right to build." "I have every legal right," Caleb said, still without looking at him. "That's not what my uncle's surveyor says." Cole uncrossed his arms and straightened from the counter. "The water that feeds that basin runs off land my uncle has prior claim to. What you're building is an obstruction of natural drainage. There are county statutes." Caleb put both hands flat on the counter and looked at Porter. "Ned, the list." Porter began moving with the focused efficiency of a man grateful for a task to concentrate on. Cole stepped closer. He was not a large man, but he moved with the deliberate precision of someone who has calculated angles. "There's also the question of the woman living in your house," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, an undercurrent in it now that had not been there before. "Unmarried woman, unmarried man, no formal arrangement on record. People in this town have standards, Harrow. My uncle has friends on the county board who take an interest in those standards." Caleb turned from the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward aggressively. He simply turned and looked at Cole Holt with the full weight of his attention, and what was in his face was not anger, which can be deflected, but something quieter and more absolute. "Say one more word about her," Caleb said. "Go ahead." The room was very still. Cole Holt was intelligent enough to read what he was looking at. He held Caleb's gaze for a moment, and then very slightly he recalibrated. "Warren Doyle is my cousin," Cole said, shifting to a different approach with the ease of a man accustomed to finding alternate routes when the direct path closes. "He is not a bad man. He made a decision at that train station that I would not personally have made. But I would ask you to consider that the woman you are so protective of may have a history that complicates the picture." "The history I'm aware of," Caleb said, "is that she sat on a platform bench for 8 hours in August heat because a man decided she wasn't what he ordered, like she was a piece of dry goods he could send back. If that's the family you're defending, you should take a long look at what you're defending." Cole's jaw tightened, a small motion controlled quickly. Ask her about Cincinnati, Cole said. He said it quietly, which made it land harder. Before Sunday. Ask her what happened there. He gathered himself, picked up his hat from the counter, and moved toward the door. He stopped in the frame and looked back at Caleb with something in his expression that had moved past performance into something more genuine and less comfortable. The meeting is Sunday. My uncle will have his attorney present. Think carefully about what you're planning to say. He left. The room exhaled slowly. Porter had Caleb's order assembled with commendable speed. Caleb paid and loaded the wagon and drove home in the cooling evening with Cole's last words sitting in his chest like a stone he could not shift. He did not ask her that night. He ate supper and he helped clear the table and he went out to check on the remaining cattle and came back in and sat on the porch for a while and thought about what a man owed another person when he had taken them in on trust and what that trust meant and how he wanted to ask the question when he asked it in a way that was fair. He asked her the following morning. They were in the kitchen and breakfast was finished and she was pouring the last of the coffee and he was still at the table and he said without introduction, Cole Holt told me to ask you about Cincinnati. She set the coffee pot down on the stove with the same steadiness that she set everything down without hurry, without fumbling. Then she sat down across from him. She did not ask how he had come to hear it or what Cole had implied. She seemed to have been waiting for this conversation with the patience of someone who knows a particular bill is going to come due eventually and has been deciding how to pay it. Before Dunmore, she said there was another arrangement. A man named George Alderman in Cincinnati, a merchant, widowed his letter said, church-going, respectable. I had been 3 years without work after the tailor's shop, where I had worked for 7 years, was sold, and the new owner brought his own staff. I had no family. I had $40 and a room I was paying for week by week. She paused. I made the decision that I make in conditions of limited options, which is to move toward the best available thing and deal with the complications when they arise. He waited. I arrived in Cincinnati on a Thursday evening. A neighbor of Mr. Alderman's came to the station to meet me because Alderman himself had been detained, she said. She seemed uncertain about something. I noticed it but did not know what it meant. Eliza folded her hands on the table in the way he had come to know as the posture she took when she was being precise. That evening at the boarding house where she had arranged for me to stay, she came to my room. She told me that Mr. Alderman did have a wife, that his wife was very ill and had been ill for some time, and that Mr. Alderman had made certain arrangements in anticipation of a future he had perhaps been too eager to begin while the present was still ongoing. Caleb said nothing. I left the next morning, Eliza said. Before Alderman came to call, I did not speak to him. I did not explain myself to him or to anyone in that city. I simply took my bag and left on the earliest train available. She held his gaze with the directness that was simply her way. What I could not control was what he said afterward. He told people that I had presented myself under false pretenses, that I had misrepresented my situation. He had money and a position in that community, and I had a train ticket back to nothing, and his version of events traveled faster and further than mine ever could. The kitchen was very quiet. So, she said, you have the full account. I did not deceive anyone. I left when I understood the situation I had walked into, and I have been dealing with the reputation that a dishonest man's dishonesty left me with ever since. She stopped. If that changes what you think of me, I understand it. The train on Thursday? Stop, Caleb said. She stopped. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the table, and he thought about the kind of courage it took to do what she had described, to arrive in a strange city to discover in one evening that the foundation of what you had come for was rotten, and to leave before dawn without demanding explanation or compensation or justice, simply because staying would have required tolerating something intolerable, and then to carry the cost of someone else's lie without the luxury of being able to defend herself in the places where it mattered. You did the right thing in a situation where the right thing cost you everything, he said. There is nothing in that account to think less of you for. The only dishonesty in that story belongs to a man with the last name Alderman. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed in a way he could not have described, precisely not a breaking down, not a softening, but more like the very slight relaxation of a tension that has been maintained for so long, it has been mistaken for a natural state. The small loosening of something held very tight for a very long time. I did not know, she said carefully, when I sat down at this table, whether I would finish this conversation with a place to sleep tonight. You will finish every conversation at this table with a place to sleep, he said. That is not conditional on anything. She nodded once. It was the most substantial nod he had ever seen. They went back to work. The dam continued to grow. The days continued their brutal heat and their long labor and their short evenings, and something continued to develop between the two people working on either side of it that neither of them named, because naming things too early is how you scare them off, and both of them had learned through different wounds that patience is not weakness, but a form of respect for the thing that is forming. The night the men came to destroy the dam, there had been no warning. Caleb came awake in the dead hours before dawn to the sound of horses moving at a pace that was not casual, coming from the south going northeast toward the basin. He lay still in the dark for 2 seconds, processing what he was hearing, and then he was out of bed and pulling on his boots with the particular speed of a man who has worked outdoors his whole life and knows the difference between sounds that are ordinary and sounds that are not. He went out the back door without lighting a lamp and moved fast through the yard, crossing the dark field toward the east rise. The moon was partial, but the sky was clear, and he could see as he came over the rise the moving orange light of 5 torches down in the basin. 5 men, standing on either side of the dam wall with tools in their hands. Cole Holt stood in the center with a long iron pry bar resting on his shoulder, the torch in his other hand throwing his face into alternating light and shadow. Flanking him were 4 others, a hired man named Roy Hicks, who Caleb knew by reputation as someone who could be paid to do most things, Pete Sander, a farmer from the South Valley, who owed Douglas Holt 3 seasons of back payments on a loan, a third man whose face was wrapped in a kerchief against the night air, or against recognition, and on the far left, standing slightly apart from the others with the sledgehammer he was holding, the way a man holds something he has not yet decided to use, a young man of about 20 years old whose name was Owen Tate. Caleb came down the basin slope and stopped 20 feet from Cole Holt. "Cole," he said, his voice was very level, "put the bar down." "Orders are orders," Cole said. He was not agitated. He had the manner of a man doing an unpleasant but straightforward piece of work. "Whose orders are worth destroying the only guaranteed water source for 12 families in this valley," Caleb said. "Because that is what this dam is. It is not mine. It belongs to every person downstream of it. Your families are in that valley too." "The only family I work for is the Holts," Cole said. "Then you're working for the wrong people." Cole tightened his grip on the bar. The torchlight moved in the night wind, and the shadows of the men moved with it. Caleb looked past Cole to Owen Tate. "Owen," he said. The young man did not respond, but he looked up. "I know your mother," Caleb said. "Martha Tate. I know what she pays Douglas Holt every week for the right to pull water off land that her husband worked for 30 years before he died. I know she sells eggs to make that payment. I know the money is more than she can spare and less than she should ever have to pay for water." He paused. "This dam changes that, not just for her, for everyone in this valley who has been paying Douglas Holt for something that should never have had a price on it." "Shut your mouth, Harrow," Cole said, but his eyes moved to Owen. Owen Tate was looking at the dam wall. He had been building it in his mind's eye for the past 30 seconds. Caleb could see it, seeing the weeks of labor in it, the purpose of it, the water it would hold, and what that water would mean. "I'm not doing it," Owen said. The words were quiet. They came out with the slight roughness of something that cost the speaker something real. But they were clear, and they did not waver. Cole turned to him sharply. "Tate, no." Owen set the sledgehammer down in the dirt with a sound that was small, but final. Pete Sander looked at Owen, then at the dam, then at his own torch. He thought about his loan, and he thought about his children, and he was clearly doing a calculation that involved more variables than the situation had seemed to offer when he had agreed to come out here tonight. He stepped back, not far, just 1 step, but it was a step in a direction. Roy Hicks and the kerchiefed man exchanged a look. They were hired labor, not invested parties. The arithmetic of a job that required force against an opponent who had just acquired moral weight and 2 defectors was not the arithmetic they had been given when they had agreed to the night's work. Roy Hicks dropped his torch in the dirt and ground it out under his boot heel. The other man followed. Cole Holt stood alone with his pry bar and his torch, and Caleb stood across from him in the dark, and the basin was very quiet except for the sound of the night wind moving through the dry grass above them. "This is not over," Cole said. "It never is," Caleb said. "But the dam is." Cole held for a long moment. Then he let the pry bar drop. The sound of iron on dry ground echoed across the basin and up the slopes and disappeared into the dark sky. He left without another word. The others followed him up the south slope and over the rise, and then there was only the sound of horses moving away into the darkness until that too was gone. Caleb stood alone in the basin for a moment. Then he heard a footstep behind him, light and deliberate, and turned to find Eliza coming down the slope from the north, moving through the moonlight, with a short section of fence rail in her hand, held easily at her side in the manner of someone who brought it for practical purposes. He looked at her. He looked at the rail. "What were you planning to do with that?" he said. "Whatever needed doing," she said. He held her gaze across the dark basin for a moment, and something that might have been a smile moved across his face, brief and genuine, the first one in longer than he could account for. They walked back up the slope together and across the dark field toward the house, and somewhere in the middle of that walk, on a narrow section of the path where the tall grass pressed in from both sides, her shoulder came against his. Neither of them moved away. The path was narrow, and they both knew it, and they both knew that the path was not actually the reason neither of them moved away. He understood something walking across that dark field with the woman who had come out in the night with a fence rail, rather than stay safe behind a locked door, that he had not understood before, and that could not be understood before, because some things require their moment and their circumstances and cannot be arrived at by any other route. He did not want her to leave. Not from the ranch, though, that was also true. He did not want her to leave the way he did not want to wake up tomorrow in the house alone, the way he did not want to eat breakfast at an empty table, the way he did not want the particular quality of the silence to return to what it had been before she had stepped off a train and refused in the face of all available evidence to come apart. He walked beside her in the dark and said nothing about any of this because it was too new and too uncertain and too important to be said carelessly. But he knew it. And in the quiet, careful way that important things sometimes make themselves known between people who are paying attention, he suspected she might know it too. 2 days before Sunday's town meeting, the letter from the bank arrived. Roy Webb brought it out personally, which was never a good sign. Caleb opened it at the kitchen table in the afternoon while Eliza was outside seeing to the cattle, and he read it twice because the first reading did not seem fully real, and the second reading confirmed that it was. The bank required partial payment on the outstanding loan balance within 30 days. The amount was substantial. The language was the kind that has been softened by legal training without actually becoming soft. He put the letter on the table and sat with it for a while. He had known this was coming in the way that a man knows a storm is coming for days before it arrives, watching the signs accumulate, while hoping the signs are wrong. He was not surprised. He was only tired in a way that sat deeper than physical exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of a person who has been fighting on multiple fronts for too long and who is beginning to lose the clear sense of why the fighting matters. He got up and went to the cabinet where he kept the whiskey he had not touched in nearly 2 years, and he poured a measure of it, and he sat back down at the table. He was on the second glass when Eliza came in. She stood in the doorway and looked at the letter on the table and the glass in his hand and his face, which was doing things he was not managing. Then she came and sat down across from him without being asked. "I should sell," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. "Holt has been right about one thing the whole time. Everything I touch falls apart. The cattle are dying, the well is gone, the bank is calling, and here I am building a dam that 5 men came to destroy last night because I can't even protect the one thing I've managed to do in 3 years that might actually matter." He turned the glass on the table. "Maybe the sensible thing, the thing that was always going to happen, is to take what Holt is offering and walk away with something before I end up walking away with nothing." The glass slipped from his fingers, not far, but enough. The whiskey spread across the table in a small dark pool. Eliza did not reach for a cloth. She did not stand up. She looked at him across the whiskey and the letter and the evidence of a man at the edge of what he can hold. And she said, "You kept your word to me." He looked at her. "On a train platform you had never been to with a woman you had never seen, you kept your word. No one made you. There was nothing in it for you. You did it because it was the right thing. She held his gaze steadily. You stood in front of Cole Holt and his men on a public street, and you told him that what he said about me was not acceptable. You stood alone in a basin in the dark with 5 armed men, and you talked 3 of them out of destroying the work we had done together. A pause. You are not a man who breaks things, Caleb. You are a man who is carrying more than one person's share of a weight. That is a different problem entirely. The kitchen was very quiet. Let me help you carry it, she said. Her voice was steady and not gentle, not the gentleness of someone trying to make him feel better, but the steadiness of someone making an offer of something real and substantial and meant. She put her hand against his face. It was warm and it was firm, and it was the hand of someone who has worked in this same soil for the same purpose, alongside the same struggle, and who is choosing right now to be here for all of it. He put his hand over hers. He did not speak her name out loud in the way a man speaks a word he has been careful with. But in the silence between them, in the lamplight, and the spilled whiskey, and the letter from the bank, something settled into place that had been trying to find its position for weeks. Roy Webb arrived before sunrise the following morning with a folder of papers he had been quietly assembling for the better part of 2 weeks' county land records and surveyor's maps. He had pulled without telling anyone, why piecing together what he had suspected since the first time Holt's name had come up in connection with the Harrow land. He spread them on the kitchen table and showed Caleb what he had found. Douglas Holt was not simply trying to acquire a parcel of land. He was building toward the control of the entire watershed that supplied Dunmore and the 2 towns to the east. The maps showed it clearly once you knew what you were looking at. A channel here, a retention pond there. The Harrow land is the final critical piece that would give Holt's private water system unobstructed access to the main underground aquifer. Once complete, Holt could set the price of water for the entire region. The families who had been paying $2 a week would be paying $5. The families who could not pay $5 would lose their land, and those parcels would be available for purchase at the pace of desperation. This is not about your ranch, Roy said. It never was. Caleb looked at the maps for a long time. Sunday, he said. Sunday, Roy confirmed. You need to win Sunday, Caleb, not just for yourself. After Roy left, Caleb stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the east field, at the unfinished dam on the horizon, at the sky above it where clouds were beginning, finally tentatively to build in the distance. He reached up to the high shelf above the kitchen window and took down the small cedar box that had sat there for 20 years. He opened it. Inside, on a square of folded cloth, was a narrow silver ring that had belonged to his mother. She had given it to him the year before she died, when he was 15, with the instruction that he was not to give it to the first woman who made his heart race, because hearts were not reliable judges of character, but to the woman who made him feel in the ordinary quiet of an ordinary day that things were going to be all right. He had chosen Margaret's family ring for the proposal instead, and Margaret had deserved the better ring, and he had never regretted that choice. But his mother's ring had waited on that shelf patient as the land itself. He closed the box and held it in his hand for a moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and went to find Eliza to tell her about Sunday. The storm was still building in the distance, but it was building. The Sunday morning came in cool and gray, which was unusual for August in Texas, and which felt to a man who had learned to read the land's moods the way he read weather, like something intentional. Like the sky had decided to give the day a different quality than the days surrounding it, a pause in the heat, a held breath before whatever came next. Caleb was up before 4. He did not need the alarm of habit that morning because he had not slept with any depth. He had lain in the dark and listened to the house and thought about what the day required and gone through it the way a man goes through a difficult thing, before it happens, turning it over, finding the angles, looking for the places where he was weak, and deciding what to do about them. By 3 in the morning, he had stopped trying to sleep and simply lay still with his eyes open and let the dark be what it was. He rose and washed his face and shaved with more care than he usually gave the task, working the razor slowly along his jaw in the lamplight and examining the result with the slightly removed attention of a man who is thinking about something else but wants to do the present thing correctly. He dressed in the white shirt that he kept for church and funerals and the occasions that required a man to present himself as something more assembled than his daily work allowed. He had worn it to Margaret's funeral. He had worn it once since to a county commissioners meeting 2 years ago when he had gone to contest a property boundary survey that had been done incorrectly. He had won that contest. He intended to win today. The cravat was a problem. The cravat, he had not tied one in long enough that the muscle memory had deserted him, and he stood at the small mirror in his room and worked at it with diminishing patience through 3 attempts before he heard the door behind him and felt her presence in the doorway without turning around. He heard her cross the room. Then her hands came over his shoulders and took the ends of the cravat from him without comment and worked them into a clean, even knot with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and who understood that the situation required competence rather than conversation. He looked at the result in the mirror. "Does this look foolish?" he asked. "It looks like a man who is going to tell the truth in front of people who need to hear it," she said. "That is enough." He turned and looked at her. She had put on her blue dress, the one she had arrived in, which had been washed and pressed in the time since her arrival until it had recovered something of its original quality. Her hair was done up with more care than the working days required. She looked like someone who understood that this day mattered and had prepared for it accordingly. He had not asked if she was coming. He had assumed with a particular assumption that develops between people who have been working alongside each other through crisis that she would make her own decision about it. When she had climbed onto the wagon bench beside him without being invited and without asking permission, he had understood that the decision was already made and had simply picked up the reins. He looked at her now in the doorway of his room on Sunday morning and said, "Whatever happens today." She waited. "Whatever happens today," he said again, "the arrangement between us does not change." She held his gaze for a moment with those steady gray eyes and then nodded once. The small, precise nod that he had learned meant she had received the thing fully and did not require it to be said again. They ate a quick breakfast in the early gray light and went out to hitch the wagon. When he helped her up onto the bench, she settled into the middle of the seat the way she had for weeks now, neither edge no longer keeping the careful distance of those first days. He noticed before he picked up the reins that the right side of the bench was no longer dusty. He did not remember when that had changed. He thought it had probably changed gradually, the way most things that matter change without announcement and without anyone deciding it had happened until one day it simply had. The road to Dunmore was not empty. Other wagons appeared ahead of them and behind them as they got closer to town, families from the outlying farms and ranches moving toward the white clapboard building of First Baptist, with the particular Sunday morning purposefulness of people who know the day holds more than Scripture. Children sat in the backs of wagons with their legs hanging over the tailgates. Men drove with their hats in their laps or pulled low. Women sat straight-backed in their best clothes and talked in low voices or looked at the road ahead without talking at all. Caleb drove and did not speak. Eliza sat beside him close enough that the sleeve of her dress was against his arm, and he was aware of this the whole way to town without either of them acknowledging it. He was aware also of the cedar box in his jacket pocket, of its small weight against his ribs, and of the fact that he had been carrying it all morning without having decided what exactly he was going to do with it. He did not know if today was the day. He only knew that he had put it in his pocket and that his hands had not taken it out. The church was full in a way it was not usually full on ordinary Sundays. Every pew was taken, and men were standing along the side walls and the back wall, and the air inside was warm with the heat of bodies and the particular charged quality of a room full of people who are all waiting for the same thing to begin. Caleb came through the door with Eliza beside him and felt the shift in the room's attention, not hostile, but present, the collective awareness of an assembly that has an interest in everything that enters it this morning. He found seats in the middle section. Frank Hadley and his wife were in the row ahead, and Frank turned and gripped Caleb's hand without speaking, and Caleb returned the grip, and that was enough. Roy Cassidy was 3 rows back and gave a small nod. Martha Tate was on the far side of the aisle with Owen beside her, and she looked at Caleb with an expression that held something complex in it, gratitude and worry, and the particular quiet determination of a woman who has been surviving on her own for long enough that she recognizes the look on the faces of other survivors. Douglas Holt sat in the front row. He had chosen the front pew with the deliberateness of a man making a statement. He sat with his broad back straight and his gray suit impeccable and his hands folded on his knee, and beside him sat a man with a leather satchel and the particular bearing of a lawyer from a larger city who has been hired specifically for the purpose of making the opposition feel outgunned. Cole Holt stood against the wall to the right, arms folded, watching the room fill with the focused attentiveness of someone cataloging information. Reverend Arthur Finch took the pulpit. He was 68 years old and thin, in the way that certain old men are thin, not diminished but refined, as though the years had removed everything that was not essential and left only the structural elements. The broad forehead and the clear eyes, and the voice that had always been the most powerful thing about him. A voice that could fill a space without effort, and that had the quality of something built to last. He opened the meeting without preamble. "This town has a dispute before it," he said. "We will hear both sides in full. We will not interrupt. We will not perform. When all has been said, we will decide together as a community what is right. That is the only way this kind of question should be answered." He nodded to Douglas Holt. Holt rose. He spoke for 15 minutes, and he spoke well, which Caleb had expected, because men who have gotten as far as Douglas Holt do not get there by speaking poorly. He used the language of legality and property rights and the precedent of water usage as it had been established in the county. He cited the natural drainage patterns of the watershed. He referred twice to the county statutes that Cole had mentioned in the general store, and his lawyer opened the satchel at the precise moment each citation required documentation and produced the relevant pages with practiced timing. He concluded by describing the dam as the unilateral action of a private individual who had appropriated shared resources without consultation or legal authorization, and he said it with a regret in his voice that suggested he wished the situation were otherwise, but that the law required him to bring the matter forward. It was a good performance. Caleb watched the faces of the people in the room while it was happening and saw them doing what ordinary people do when confronted with the language of law and property, which is to feel slightly uncertain and slightly outgunned the way anyone feels when someone deploys expertise they do not share. Then Reverend Finch asked if anyone wished to speak. Martha Tate stood up before the Reverend had finished the sentence. She was 50 years old, and she had the hands of someone who had worked outdoors for all of them, and she stood up in her church clothes with the directness of a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment for considerably longer than this morning. "I paid Douglas Holt $2 a week for the right to use water on land my husband cleared and farmed for 30 years, she said. Her voice did not shake. "I pay it from the money I make selling eggs from my 12 chickens. $2 a week is not a small amount when eggs are what you have to sell. I have been paying it for 4 years. She looked at Holt, who was looking back at her with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to show reactions in public rooms. Caleb Harrow built something that changes that. He did not ask for anything from me in return. He did not tell me about it ahead of time and wait for gratitude. He just built it because it needed building and because the kind of man he is does not require an audience to do the right thing." She sat down. Frank Hadley stood. "He came to my farm the morning after the flood 2 years ago with a team and a plow, and we spent 3 days clearing my access road without him asking for a cent. I never had to ask, he just came." He sat. Roy Cassidy stood. "I was short on seed grain 3 springs ago. My wife was sick, and the money had gone to the doctor, and I was looking at a season with nothing to plant. Caleb Harrow rode over with 2 sacks of his own seed and told me I could pay it back when things were better. And if things never got better, then it was a gift and not to think about it." He paused. "Things got better. I paid it back." He acted like he had forgotten the whole transaction. He sat. 3 more people stood one after another and said their pieces, and each piece was its own kind of testimony to the quiet, consistent quality of a man who had been doing good things for 20 years in ways that did not require witnesses and had not anticipated an audience. Then Douglas Holt's lawyer stood and cleared his throat. "The character of Mr. Harrow is not in question," he said with the particular smoothness of a man who has been trained to concede small points in order to win large ones. "The question is legal, not personal. Water rights as established in this county. I would also note," Holt said, rising to stand beside his lawyer, the timing of something rehearsed, "that the personal situation in Mr. Harrow's household raises questions of its own." He looked at the room with the expression of a man reluctantly raising a concern. An unmarried woman of uncertain background, living in a bachelor's home with no formal arrangement on record. This community has standards, and those who wish to claim the moral high ground in a public forum ought to be prepared to meet them. The room shifted. It was not a large shift, but it was perceptible, the slight discomfort of an assembly that has been enjoying a clear moral picture and has just been handed something complicated. Holt had timed it well. His lawyer had laid the legal groundwork, and now Holt was adding the personal complexity, the suggestion that the man they had been applauding was perhaps not entirely what he appeared. Caleb rose from his seat. Reverend Finch looked at him and gave a small nod. He stood for a moment without speaking, gathering himself, finding the still place at the center of what he wanted to say, and speaking from it rather than from the agitation that was present in his chest and that he was choosing not to perform. "I am going to say one thing about my household," he said, "and then I am going to leave it alone because it is not what this meeting is about, and I refuse to let this morning become about anything other than what it is actually about." He looked at Douglas Holt directly. "The woman in my home came to this town on a train and was left on a platform bench by a man who decided she was not what he ordered, the way you would return a piece of equipment that came in the wrong size. She sat on that bench for 8 hours in August heat, and she did not ask a single person for help. I offered her honest work because she was a decent person in an indecent situation, and because that is what a person does." He paused. "She has worked harder for this valley and for this OM and for the people who will benefit from it than any man in this room, including me. That is all I have to say about my household." He sat down. Reverend Finch looked at the room, and Eliza stood up. Caleb had not known she was going to do it. He felt the movement beside him before he saw it and looked up to find her already on her feet, her hands at her sides, her back straight in the way it had been straight on the platform bench, the posture of someone who has learned that the spine is the last thing you surrender. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they are paying attention to something real. "My name is Eliza Crane," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. He could see them close to her sides, and they were trembling, and she was not hiding the trembling or apologizing for it, simply allowing it to exist while she spoke through it. "I came to this town 6 weeks ago on a morning train. The man who had arranged for me to come here looked at me once and left without a word. I sat on the station platform from 8 in the morning until the evening when Caleb Harrow came by for a sack of barley and decided that leaving me there was not something he was willing to do." She took a breath. "I have worked beside this man every day since that evening. I know what his hands look like after a day of digging in clay and shale. I know that he does not eat his full portion when the supplies run short and there might not be enough. I know that he stood alone in a dark basin at 2 in the morning without a weapon, facing 5 men who had been paid to destroy the work we had done together, and he talked them down not by threatening them, but by reminding them of what they actually cared about." A pause. "I know that he built that dam for this valley, not for himself, not for any legal or financial advantage, because the valley needed it and because he is the kind of man who builds what needs building when he sees the need regardless of what it costs him." She looked at Holt. "Mr. Holt speaks about community standards," she said. "I would like to ask this community what standard permits a man to charge $2 a week for water on land that families have worked for generations. What standard permits a man to buy up the desperation of his neighbors and call it business? What standard looks at what Caleb Harrow built and sees theft while looking at what Douglas Holt is building and seeing enterprise?" She stopped. Her voice was still level. "I am a woman with no land and no money and no family in this county, and I have no business standing up in this room and telling anyone what to think. But I have worked in this valley and I have seen this man, and I could not sit in this pew and let the wrong account of him stand unchallenged." She sat down. The room was absolutely still for 2 seconds. Then it was not still anymore. Reverend Finch let the sound of the room run for a moment before he raised his hand. But before he could speak, Owen Tate stood up. He stood up from the pew beside his mother, and he stood with the particular rigid posture of a young man who has made a decision that frightens him and is going to carry it through because he has decided that the alternative is worse. He was 20 years old, and he looked it, and he looked also like someone considerably older than that, which is what the right kind of decision does to a person. "I was there," he said, "at the dam the night 3 days ago when Cole Holt brought men out there to destroy it." The room became a different kind of still. Cole Holt against the wall to the right straightened almost imperceptibly. Cole paid me $2 to come, Owen said. He said it was just clearing an obstruction, private property matter legal work. He had a pry bar and the other men had tools, and the plan was to take the dam wall down before morning so there would be nothing to show at today's meeting. He stopped. I put my sledgehammer down and I left before it happened. I am telling you this because it happened and because someone who was there needs to say so in a room full of people who deserve to know. Owen sat down. His mother put her hand over his without looking at him. Douglas Holt's lawyer began quietly to replace the documents in his satchel. Holt himself sat very still with the expression of a man recalculating something in real time. Cole Holt had moved off the wall and was standing with his arms at his sides and his face doing the controlled, careful work of a man who has just been told in public something that cannot be taken back. Reverend Finch looked at the room over his reading glasses. I believe, he said in the tone of a man who has seen enough of human nature to recognize, when a question has been answered, that this community knows what it thinks. We will proceed accordingly. The vote, when it came, was not close. Douglas Holt left the church with his lawyer, and without looking at anyone, which was the only dignified option available to him, and which he took with the practiced composure of a man who has learned that there will be other days and other negotiations, and that the loss of a single public contest is not the end of anything, only the adjustment of a strategy. Cole Holt paused at the door. He turned and looked at Caleb across the length of the church, and what was in his face was not what Caleb had expected. It was not anger, it was something murkier and less comfortable, something that lived in the neighborhood of shame without being willing to call itself by that name. He held Caleb's gaze for one moment, and then he went out. After the congregation began to disperse, Owen Tate found Caleb near the door. He extended his hand and Caleb shook it. You know Holt won't forget what you did today, Caleb said. I know. Owen looked at his boots for a moment. But my mother was sitting right there. He looked back up. And I have to look at her every morning. Caleb gripped the young man's shoulder once firmly and let go. Some things required more than a handshake and fewer words than a speech. That was the right amount of both. They drove home in the afternoon light, and the sky to the west had changed while they were inside. The clouds that had been building on the far edge of the horizon for days were closer now, taller, the kind of clouds that have weight and intention in them. The air had a different texture, a slight charge in it, the faint electric quality that precedes something significant. Eliza sat beside him on the bench and looked at the horizon. You didn't have to stand up, he said. I know. You didn't know anyone in that room anything. No, she said, but I owed you the truth about what kind of man you are said in a place where it mattered. She was quiet for a moment. No one should stand in front of people and hear a wrong account of themselves without someone who knows better saying so. He held the reins and watched the road and thought about what she had said in that church, the specific thing she had named the hands after a day of clay and shale, the portion held back when supplies ran short the basin in the dark. She had been watching him the whole time in the way that he had been watching her, with the particular attention of someone who is learning a person not in order to possess them, but in order to understand what they are made of. He reached into his jacket pocket. He touched the cedar box and did not take it out. Not yet. The day still had something in it, and he was going to let the day complete itself before he added anything more to it. They got home in the late afternoon and changed out of their church clothes and went to work because there was still work to do, and because for both of them, work was the thing they returned to when they needed to be grounded in something real. He checked the cattle and she started supper, and they moved through the house and yard in the familiar pattern that 6 weeks of shared days had carved into both of them without their noticing it being carved. That night after supper, when the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean, Caleb found Frank Hadley on his porch when he stepped outside to check the horizon. Frank had not come alone. His wagon was in the yard, and in it, folded neatly on the bed, was a pile of tools. Shovels, picks, a second wheelbarrow, a coil of rope. Morning, Frank said, as if this required no explanation. It's evening, Frank. I mean, I'll be here in the morning. Frank looked at the tools in his wagon. And I won't be the only one. Caleb stood on the porch and looked at the tools and looked at Frank and did not say what he felt, because that was not how either of them operated. He said, appreciate it. Don't, Frank said. I've been drinking water from that aquifer for 30 years. I got a stake in this too. He climbed back onto his wagon. Dawn, he said, and drove off into the evening. Dawn came with more wagons than Caleb had expected. He was standing at the edge of the basin in the early light when they appeared on the rise to the north, a line of them, the wheels catching the first slant of sun as they came over the crest and down the slope. Frank Hadley in the lead as promised. Roy Cassidy behind him. The Brenner brothers from the east side of the valley, two large, quiet men who could move more earth in an hour than most people could in a morning. Tom and Sarah Whitfield with their two grown sons. Three families from the south end of the valley whose names he knew, but whose circumstances he had never fully understood until now, until they appeared on his horizon with tools in their wagon beds. And behind all of them, Martha Tate's wagon with Owen driving and Martha sitting straight-backed on the bench with a covered pot in her lap that turned out to contain enough cornbread for 20 people, which was approximately how many people were now standing in his basin with tools in their hands. Reverend Finch arrived last on foot, carrying a long-handled shovel over his shoulder, with the serenity of a man who has stopped being surprised by what the right kind of moment calls out of people. Caleb stood and looked at all of it. "Who organized this?" he asked Frank. Frank shrugged. "Nobody needed to. They worked all day. It was the best kind of work, the kind that exists when people understand what they are building and why, when the purpose of the labor is clear enough that it carries its own momentum, and the fatigue is real but not discouraging, because the thing growing in front of you is evidence that the effort is worth making." The dam wall grew through the morning and into the afternoon with a speed that no two people, however determined, could have matched, and the sounds of it filled the basin. The rhythm of tools and the low, steady sound of conversation and occasionally laughter. The particular high-carrying laughter of children who had come with their parents and who found in the basin an excellent location for the kind of games that involve running in dirt. Eliza moved through all of it with a quality that he had noticed from the very first days, but that was more visible today in the context of other people. She knew everyone's name. He did not know when she had learned them all, but she had, and she used them naturally, asking after Roy Cassidy's wife by name, and remembering that Frank Hadley's youngest had been sick the previous week and checking on the recovery. She brought water where it was needed before being asked. She worked alongside whoever needed an extra hand and moved on when that work was covered. She had become, without announcement or ceremony, a part of this place. He watched her carry a bucket of water to the Brenner brothers and say something that made the larger of the two men laugh, unexpectedly, a big, genuine sound, and he thought about the woman who had sat at the far edge of the wagon bench on the night he had driven her home, keeping the distance of someone who had been burned enough times to stop assuming that the space beside her was safe. 6 weeks, 12 miles of road, and 6 weeks of hard days and difficult conversations in a dark basin in the middle of the night. And here she was entirely at home, in a community she had come to as a stranger, and that had come to feel apparently the same way about her. The dam was finished at sunset. The last section of the spillway was packed and tamped down as the sun touched the western horizon and turned everything copper and amber, and the shadows stretched long across the basin floor. Someone shouted when the last load of material was set in place, and the shout was taken up by others. And for a moment, the basin was full of the sound of people who had done a thing together and knew the value of it. Caleb stood on the dam wall and looked down into the empty basin below it. It was ready. Everything was ready. What happened next depended on the sky. He looked west. The clouds that had been building for days were no longer on the horizon. They were overhead, enormous and dark-bellied, the kind of clouds that do not threaten rain, but guarantee it, that have passed beyond the stage of meteorological possibility into the stage of physical inevitability. The air smelled of it, the green, dark smell of water about to arrive, the smell that every person in that basin knew. The way they knew their own names, because it was the smell that meant the land would live, and they would live with it. The families packed their things and said their goodbyes and drove their wagons up over the rise as the first distant rumble of thunder came from the west. And by the time the last wagon crested the hill, Caleb and Eliza were alone in the basin with the dam behind them and the sky lowering overhead and the thunder walking closer across the plains with the slow, inevitable pace of something that has been a long time coming. They walked back to the house in the last of the light. The first drops came when they were in the yard, fat and heavy, the kind of opening drops that are almost a courtesy, a brief announcement before the real event begins. Eliza stopped walking. She was wearing her everyday dress, the practical gray one she wore for work, and she had a wrap around her shoulders that she had not yet taken off from the day, and she stopped in the middle of the yard when the first drops hit, and she tilted her face up toward the sky. Caleb stopped and watched her. Her eyes closed. The drops came harder, finding the planes of her face running into her hair, darkening the shoulders of her dress. She did not move to shelter. She stood with her face up and her eyes closed and received the rain with the full presence of someone doing something they have needed to do for a very long time and are not going to hurry. He stood and watched her for a moment. The rain was coming faster now, the drops multiplying until they were a steady presence hissing in the dry grass and pattering on the porch roof and beginning to darken the cracked earth of the yard. "You're going to be soaked through," he said. "I know," she said. She did not open her eyes. He looked at her standing in the rain with her face turned up. This woman who had come to this land with almost nothing and had given it more than she had arrived with, and he understood that the rain meant something particular to her that he did not need to fully know in order to honor. He stepped out from under the porch overhang and stood beside her in the yard and let the rain fall on him too. They stood like that together while the storm broke fully overhead, and the rain became the serious, committed Texas rain that does not apologize, the rain that fills dry creek beds and raises well levels and soaks into cracked earth so deeply that the land does not release it for months. Lightning moved across the sky to the north. Not the distant heat lightning of the dry weeks, but the real working lightning of a storm, with something to say, and the thunder that followed it was close enough to feel in the chest. From the east, even through the sound of the rain, Caleb heard it. The water, it was a low sound at first, almost lost under the rain, but growing steadily, the sound of water moving through the spillway and into the empty basin. The first water running into the first reservoir. This land had ever had the sound of something that had been absent becoming present, which is one of the only sounds that is genuinely irreversible. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the cedar box, which was wet now and smooth in his palm. "Eliza," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Rain ran down her face and she made no move to wipe it away. "You told me once," he said, "that you got on that train because it was the first time a piece of paper told you that someone wanted you to be somewhere, that there was a place for you at the end of the line." He stopped. The rain was loud around them, and he raised his voice slightly, not to shout but to be clear. "I want you to be here, not at the end of a contract, not because the terms of an arrangement require it. I want you to be here because this is your place if you want it to be, and because I cannot look at this land or this house or anything I have done in the past 6 weeks without seeing the part of it that is yours." He took the cedar box from his pocket and opened it. The ring inside his mother's narrow silver ring caught the lightning for just a moment and threw a small, cold light. "My mother told me not to give this to the first woman who made my heart race," he said, "because hearts are not reliable judges of character. She said to give it to the woman who made me believe in the ordinary quiet of an ordinary day that things were going to be all right." He looked at her. "I have not believed that in 3 years. I believe it now." The rain came down. Eliza looked at the ring in the open box, and then she looked at him, and what was in her face was not the performance of the moment, but the genuine, unguarded quality of someone receiving something they had stopped believing was available to them. "Are you certain?" she asked. "For the first time in 3 years," he said, "I am certain about something." She held out her left hand. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger, and it fit in the way that things sometimes fit when they have been waiting long enough for the right circumstance, cleanly and without resistance, as though the measurement had been taken long ago. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I should tell you," she said, "that I stopped thinking of this as temporary somewhere around the second week." "I know," he said. "You knew. You named the cows," he said. She laughed. It was the same laugh he had heard the first time she fell in the mud, brief and genuine and surprised by itself, the laugh of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been relieved of it in a way they were not prepared for. He put his arms around her in the rain, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the yard of the Harrow Ranch while the storm delivered everything it had been promising. And from the east, the sound of water filling the basin grew steadily beneath the rain, and the thunder, the sound of the land receiving what it had needed for so long. He thought about Margaret. He permitted himself to do that to hold the thought of her honestly and without flinching because she deserved that much. And because what he was doing tonight was not an erasure of what had been, but a continuation of what was. And those two things were not in conflict if a man was honest with himself. Margaret had been the whole world of him for 7 years, and she had been good, and she was gone, and the grief of that was real and would always be real, and it lived in the same chest that was now full of something else, something present and continuing in alarm, and the chest was large enough for both. He was certain of this. The ring on Eliza's finger was his mother's ring, not Margaret's, and that distinction was everything. The storm moved east through the night, dragging its rain behind it, and when the morning came, it came washed clean the sky, a hard bright blue that only exists after serious rain, has scoured the dust from it, and the air smelled of wet earth and wet grass, and the particular green smell of things that were still alive and had just been given a reason to continue. Caleb walked out to the basin before breakfast. The spillway was running clear and steady. The basin held water, not full, not deep, but present, a body of standing water in a place that had been dry, cracked earth 2 days ago, and the morning light lay across it in long gold lines that moved when the wind touched the surface. He stood on the dam wall and looked at it for a long time. A week after the meeting, Roy Webb came out with news about Douglas Holt. The plans for the channel project had been formally withdrawn from the county planning office. Holt's engineer had submitted the notice 3 days after the Sunday meeting without explanation, which did not require one. The county commissioner, who had been receiving Holt's hospitality for 2 years, had quietly recused himself from all matters relating to the Dunmore Water District. Holt himself had not been seen in town in several days, which was notable enough that people commented on it, though they did so in the careful way that people discuss powerful men whose circumstances have recently changed, aware that circumstances can change back. He's still there, Roy said. Still has his land, still has his money, but the channel is dead. Is it enough, Caleb asked. For now, Roy said. Maybe longer. Men like Holt, when they take a big public loss, they tend to find quieter territory to work in for a while. He paused. He'll be a neighbor, just not the kind you have to fight. 2 days after Roy's visit, Cole Holt appeared at the ranch. He came alone on a working horse rather than one of the fine-bred animals Holt's men usually rode, and he was in ordinary working clothes, not the pressed shirt and vest he had worn to every previous encounter. He stopped his horse in the yard and waited until Caleb came out. He did not dismount immediately. He sat for a moment in the way of a man deciding whether he is going to follow through on the thing he has come to do. Then he got down. I'm not here to apologize, he said. I'm not waiting for one, Caleb said. Cole looked at the barn, the house, the repaired fence along the north yard. Warren is my cousin, he said. What he did at the station. I knew he was going to do it. He told me the night before that he had decided the arrangement wasn't going to suit him, and I told him to at least send a letter so she could make other plans. He didn't. A pause. I didn't stop him, and I didn't tell anyone else, and I let it happen. That is on me. He reached into his jacket and brought out an envelope and held it forward. Caleb took it. He did not open it. For the cattle, Cole said, whatever those three were worth at current prices. I got the number from the stockyard in Abilene. It's honest. Why, Caleb asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, because Owen Tate stood up in that church and said what was true, and he is 20 years old, and if a 20-year-old kid can do the right thing at a cost to himself, then the least I can do is acknowledge what was wrong. He put his hat back on. My uncle and I have different ways of operating. We've had that disagreement for a long time. I work for him, but I'm not him. He mounted his horse. That's all I came to say. He rode out of the yard without looking back. Eliza had been standing in the doorway of the house. Caleb turned and saw her and held up the envelope. He didn't apologize, she said. No. But he came. Yes, Caleb said. He looked at the envelope and then at the road where Cole's horse had gone. Some people can only get so far, but he got here. The months that followed moved in the way that good months move, with the particular quality of time that is fully inhabited, rather than merely endured each day, distinct and present in the way that days are when a person is paying attention to their life rather than simply surviving it. The dam held through the fall and into the winter. The basin filled slowly with the seasonal rains and with the snowmelt from the distant hills, and by the time the dry season returned, there was enough stored water to carry the herd through it without the desperate calculations of the year before. The well recovered slowly as water tables do when the land is no longer completely starved, and by spring it was pulling clear water at a depth that suggested it would hold. Caleb rebuilt the left support post on the porch with cedar that Frank Hadley helped him cut from the stand along the creek. He rehangs the porch roof and replaced 3 sections of fence along the south pasture. Small repairs, the kind that accumulate into the overall condition of a place, and that a man alone does not always have the time or the motivation to address, but that 2 people working together can attend to steadily. Eliza planted a garden in the spring. She had been planting in it since November. He understood when he found her making notes about soil conditions and sun exposure in the back of the household ledger that she had begun keeping with the same precise care she brought to everything. The garden went in along the south side of the house where the light was best, and it grew with a vigor that she attributed to the soil, and that he suspected had something to do with the particular attention she gave to it, the way she talked to it in the low, ordinary voice she had used for the cattle, as though things responded to being addressed directly. The cattle numbered 82 by summer, not back to what they had been at the height of things, but better than the 60 that had survived the worst of it, and better still in condition, no longer carrying the gaunt look of animals that had been running on insufficient water for too long. The Harrow Ranch began to look like what Eliza had said on the first night it had looked like to her, and the saying of it had turned out to be a kind of promise that the place was now in the process of keeping. Owen Tate came by on a Saturday in early summer to ask if he could use the shop behind the barn to work on a piece of equipment. Caleb said yes, and Owen came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and within a month it had become understood, without any formal arrangement, that Owen Tate was available for work when it was available, and that the shop behind the barn was available to him when it was not. He had the mechanical instinct that certain people have, the kind that sees the interior logic of machines and knows intuitively what is wrong and how to address it, and within the summer, several of the neighboring farms had begun bringing him equipment to look at. "He needs a real shop," Eliza said one evening. "He does," Caleb agreed. "There is that unused building behind the east pasture," she said. "It has good walls and a sound roof." Caleb looked at her across the supper table. "You want to set up a young man in business on our property?" "I want to give someone a place to build something," she said, "in the same way someone gave me a place to build something." She met his eyes directly. "It seems like the right use of unused space." He thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "I'll talk to him tomorrow," he said. 2 rocking chairs appeared on the porch in September. He had made them himself in the evenings when the light lasted long enough, following the pattern his father had used, the same proportions, the same angle of the back, the same slight unevenness in the runners that he had never been able to entirely eliminate, but that his father had always said was what made a chair human rather than furniture. They sat in them in the evenings after supper, when the work was done and the light was going, and they looked out at the land together. Some evenings they talked about what needed doing and what had been done. Some evenings they talked about things that had nothing to do with the ranch's small observations about the day, or memories, or the particular quality of the light at that hour. Some evenings they said very little at all, because they had arrived at the stage of things where silence between them was inhabited rather than empty, where the not talking was itself a form of presence. The evening that changed everything else came in late August, just over a year from the evening Caleb had driven home from Dunmore with a near-empty wagon and a woman he did not know sitting at the far edge of the bench. They were in the rocking chairs. The fireflies had come out, which they did in numbers, in late August, drifting through the dark yard, in their slow signaling patterns, the light appearing and disappearing, with a patience that suggested they had all the time in the world to be seen. Eliza had been quiet in a way that was slightly different from her ordinary quiet. Not troubled, not withdrawn. Simply internal, in the way of someone whose attention is more fully on something they are thinking than on the external world. He had noticed it at supper, and he noticed it now, and he waited because, with her, he had learned that waiting was almost always the right response. She stopped rocking. She took his hand from the arm of his chair and held it and turned it palm up. Then she placed his hand flat against the front of her dress, just below the ribs, and held it there with both of hers. He did not speak. He sat very still. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said, though he was only beginning to know. "We are going to have a child." He held still with the knowledge of it, feeling it move through him in layers, the immediate physical fact of it, and then the enormity of it, and then the particular way in which the enormity was not what he might have expected, which is to say, it was not frightening, and it was not shadowed by the grief he had been afraid might shadow everything. It was large and clean and present, a fact of the future arriving in the present, a door opening into something he had stopped believing was available to him. He closed his fingers around her hand. His eyes were full. He let them be. He had stopped apologizing for the things his body did honestly. He thought about Thomas. He let himself think about Thomas fully. The brown-green eyes, the morning run to the barn, the specific weight of him when he was asleep, and Caleb had carried him to bed. He thought about Margaret, who had known what Caleb was before he had fully known it himself, and who had loved him into the knowledge of it. He held both of them in the full, clear knowledge of what they had been and what they had meant and what their absence had cost him. And he held them alongside this, alongside the hand in his, and the life beginning, and the woman in the chair beside him, who had sat on a platform bench for 8 hours in August, heat and had not broken, and who had walked into his life and rebuilt it in ways she had not been asked to and had stayed because she had chosen to, and who was now telling him that the future he had stopped believing in was not only possible, but arriving. These things were not in conflict. They were all true at once the way the land is true. All at once, the drought and the rain together, the dead grass and the new growth coming up through it, the cracked earth and the water filling the basin. Everything that has been lost and everything that is still here in the simple, continuing fact of the morning moment again. If it's a boy, he said, and his voice came out with the roughness of what he was containing, I would like to call him Thomas. She was quiet. And if it's a girl, she asked. He thought for a moment in the full and honest way of a man who knows what he is thinking and is not going to pretend otherwise. Margaret, he said. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight from inside, in the soft, intermittent light of the fireflies, her face was open in a way it was not always open. All its usual careful qualities set aside, simply present and real, and looking at him with complete understanding. She brought his hand up and held it against her face the way he had held her injured hand in the basin on that first working day, the same careful attention, the same complete presence. Yes, she said. They sat together on the porch of the Harrow Ranch in the late summer evening while the fireflies moved through the dark yard below them and the windmill turned steadily in the night wind, and the basin to the east held its water quietly in the dark, ready for whatever dry season came next. Caleb Harrow, 37 years old, who had driven to Dunmore one evening for a sack of barley and had come home with the beginning of everything, sat in the chair. His father's hands had taught him to make, and held the hand of the woman who had looked at his broken ranch and seen what it could be. He had been wrong about a great many things in the years of his grief. He knew that now. But sitting here with her hand in his and the windmill turning and the basin full in the dark to the east, he found he did not need to catalog the errors. The correction was enough, the last good rain, and it had been enough.